A little girl warns Millionaire, don't let her touch the will. He rewrites everything. Before we go further, subscribe if you know humanity can heal what's broken. Enjoy the story. In the quiet suburbs of Portland, where ancient oak trees whispered secrets through mansion windows, 7-year-old Sophie Ward pressed her small face against the cool glass of her bedroom window. Below, the garden where her mother Clara once taught her about justice and truth lay dormant in the early morning mist. 6 months had passed since the accident that took Clara away forever. 6 months since Sophie's world crumbled into a puzzle of adult conversations, hushed phone calls, and a father who smiled but never quite reached his eyes anymore. Sophie clutched her mother's old law book, a thick, worn volume that smelled like lavender and wisdom. Clara used to read her stories from it, not fairy tales about princesses, but real stories about brave people who stood up for what was right. Always remember, sweetheart, Clara's voice echoed in Sophie's memory. Papers and signatures are sacred things. Never let anyone pressure Daddy into signing something when his heart is too heavy to think clearly. The little girl didn't fully understand what those words meant then, but she was about to discover their life-changing importance. Downstairs, Ethan Ward, CEO of MedTech Innovations, sat in his home office surrounded by documents that could reshape his family's entire future. At 41, he had built an empire in medical technology, but grief had made him vulnerable in ways that success never could. His usually sharp business instincts were clouded by the fog of loss and the desperate need to rebuild some semblance of happiness. Vanessa Sterling stood behind him, her perfectly manicured hands resting gently on his shoulders. To anyone watching, she appeared to be the picture of devoted support, a woman who had stepped into Ethan's life during his darkest hour and brought light back into his days. Her voice was soft honey when she spoke about their future together, about building a new family that would honor Clara's memory while moving forward. But Sophie saw something others missed. In those rare moments when Vanessa thought no one was watching, her mask slipped. There was a hardness in her eyes, a calculated precision in her movements that reminded Sophie of the villains in her mother's legal stories. That morning, as golden sunlight filtered through the estate's tall windows, Sophie witnessed something that would change everything. She had been tiptoeing downstairs to get her favorite cereal when she heard the distinct sound of her father's private safe being opened. The safe that contained the most important documents in their family's life. Sophie peered around the corner and froze. There was Vanessa, alone in the study, her elegant fingers rifling through papers with the expertise of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. The woman's face held none of the gentle concern she displayed when Ethan was present. Instead, Sophie saw concentration, determination, and something that made the little girl's stomach twist with fear. Vanessa pulled out a thick document. Sophie recognized it as her father's will, the paper her mother had once explained as Daddy's promise about who gets to take care of our family's treasures if something happens to him. Vanessa spread the document on the desk, and Sophie watched in growing alarm as the woman took photos of each page with her phone. When Vanessa noticed a section near the end of the document, her lips curled into what Sophie could only describe as a hungry smile. The little girl didn't understand the legal language, but she understood that expression. It was the same look her friend's older brother got when he was planning to take someone's lunch money. Sophie's heart hammered against her small chest. Something was very, very wrong. When Ethan appeared in the doorway minutes later, Vanessa had already returned the will to the safe and was casually arranging flowers on his desk. "Good morning, darling," she said, her voice once again the warm melody that had charmed Sophie's father. "I thought these roses would brighten your workspace." But Sophie had seen the truth. And as her mother had taught her, truth was the most powerful weapon against injustice. That evening, as Ethan reviewed quarterly reports in his study, Sophie approached with the careful determination of someone carrying a message too important to ignore. She clutched her mother's law book like a shield, her brown eyes serious beyond her 7 years. "Daddy," she began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I need to tell you something about Vanessa." Ethan looked up from his papers, his expression softening with the gentle patience he reserved for his daughter's concerns. In the months since Clara's death, Sophie had been his anchor, the one pure thing in a world that suddenly felt uncertain and gray. "What is it, sweetheart?" Sophie took a deep breath, remembering her mother's advice about speaking truth clearly and without fear. "I saw her in your safe today. She was looking at papers and taking pictures with her phone. When she saw the will, she smiled. But not a happy smile, a scary smile." The words hung in the air between them. Ethan's pen stopped moving across the page, and for a moment, the only sound was the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. The same clock that had measured Clara's presence in this house and now marked her absence. "Sophie?" Ethan said gently, setting down his pen and giving her his full attention. "Vanessa was probably just trying to organize things for me. She's been so helpful since—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Since Clara died. Since their world fell apart. Since he had needed someone to help him function through the fog of grief. But Sophie shook her head with the fierce certainty that only children possess when they know they've witnessed something adults don't want to see. "No, Daddy, she was hiding it. When you came in, she pretended to be fixing flowers, but I saw her put the papers away really fast." She opened her mother's law book to a page she had memorized, pointing to a passage about fraud and deception. "Mom read me this story about people who trick others into signing papers. She said I should always watch out for you, especially when you're sad, because sad people sometimes can't see the bad things coming." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, but he pushed it away. Vanessa had been his salvation in the darkest period of his life. She had held him when grief threatened to drown him, had brought structure back to his chaotic days, had shown Sophie kindness when the little girl had been suspicious of any woman trying to fill her mother's place. "Sophie, honey, I think you might be misunderstanding what you saw. Vanessa loves us. She wants to be part of our family." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but not tears of sadness, tears of frustration at not being believed. "Daddy, Mom told me to always be careful who is allowed to sign papers for you. She made me promise to watch and tell you if anyone tried to hurt our family's promises." The mention of Clara's specific words struck Ethan like a physical blow. He remembered that conversation, one of the last coherent talks they'd had before the accident. Clara, intuitive as always, had sensed her own mortality and had been trying to prepare their daughter for dangers she might not even have been able to name. "Don't let her touch the will, Daddy. Please. Mom told me that the will is sacred. It's your promise about who gets to protect our family's love and treasures. If someone bad changes it, they can steal everything Mom wanted us to keep safe." Ethan knelt down to Sophie's level, taking her small hands in his. Her earnest face, so much like Clara's, looked back at him with an expression that was both childlike and ancient with inherited wisdom. "I promise I'll be careful, sweetheart. But Vanessa isn't trying to hurt us. She's trying to help us heal." Sophie nodded, but Ethan could see she wasn't convinced. As he tucked her into bed that night, she whispered, "Daddy, can you ask Mr. Hal to look at the papers? Mom always said he could see things that other people missed." Mr. Hal. Ethan hadn't thought about his father's old friend in weeks. Harold Morrison had been the family's legal advisor for decades, a mentor who had guided Ethan through his first business deals and had been Clara's trusted confidant. If anyone could put Sophie's fears to rest, or confirm them, it would be Hal. As Ethan kissed his daughter goodnight, he made a mental note to call the old man in the morning, not because he believed Sophie's suspicions, but because sometimes the wisdom of a child deserved the investigation of experience. What Ethan didn't know was that in the guest room down the hall, Vanessa was on her phone with someone whose voice carried the cold efficiency of professional greed. "The child is becoming a problem," Vanessa whispered into the darkness. "She's watching me too closely. We need to move faster than planned." The next morning brought the kind of gray November day that seemed to mirror the uncertainty growing in Ethan's mind. Sophie's words had planted a seed of doubt that grew stronger with each passing hour, especially as he noticed things he had previously overlooked, the way Vanessa's phone conversation stopped abruptly when he entered the room. the sudden interest she had developed in his business documents, claiming she wanted to understand his world better. The fact that she had volunteered to help organize his personal papers she had no real need to access. When Morrison arrived at the Ward estate that afternoon, Sophie practically bounced with relief. At 75, Hal moved with the deliberate care of someone who had learned to conserve energy for the battles that truly mattered. His silver hair was immaculately combed, his gray eyes sharp with the kind of intelligence that had made him one of Portland's most respected legal minds before his retirement. Uncle Hal. Sophie ran to him with the enthusiasm she usually reserved for Christmas morning. Despite not being a blood relative, Hal had been part of the Ward family for so long that titles like uncle felt more appropriate than formal addresses. "My dear Sophie," Hal said, his voice carrying the warm authority that had comforted 3 generations of the Ward family through legal and personal crises. "Your father tells me you have some concerns about family documents." Sophie nodded vigorously, then lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I saw her taking pictures of Daddy's will, and she had that look, like when someone is planning something sneaky." Hal listened with the serious attention he had always given to Sophie's observations. Unlike many adults, he had learned never to dismiss a child's instincts about people. Children, he believed, saw truth with a clarity that adults often lost in their desire to see only what was convenient or comfortable. "Would you like me to review the will with your father?" Hal asked, "just to make sure everything is exactly as it should be?" Relief flooded Sophie's face. Finally, someone was taking her seriously. When Ethan joined them in the study, he carried a copy of his will, the same document Vanessa had been photographing. Hal accepted the papers with the reverence of someone who understood that wills were more than legal documents. They were final love letters, last promises, and bridges between the living and the dead. As Hal began to read, his expression shifted from casual interest to focused concern. His trained eye caught something that would have been invisible to most people but stood out like a beacon to someone with decades of document analysis experience. "Ethan," Hal said quietly, adjusting his reading glasses, "when was this will last modified?" "Not since Clara died." "Why?" Hal pointed to a section near the end of the document. "These paragraphs here, they're in a slightly different font than the rest of the document. See how the letter spacing is just a fraction wider? And the line height is marginally different?" Ethan leaned closer, squinting at details he would never have noticed. I don't see it." "It's subtle, but it's there. This suggests that this section was either replaced or inserted after the original document was created." Hal's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering potentially devastating news. "It's possible this was done during a legitimate update by your lawyer's office, but what? But given Sophie's observations about someone photographing this document, I think we need to investigate further." Sophie, who had been listening with the intensity of someone whose suspicions were finally being validated, spoke up. "What does that part say, the part that's different?" Hal read carefully. "This section modifies the inheritance distribution to include provisions for any future spouse of the testator, specifically including but not limited to one Vanessa Sterling, who shall receive 40% of all liquid assets and controlling interest in all real estate holdings." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He grabbed the document, reading and rereading the passage. I never wrote this. I never authorized this change." Hal's expression was grim. "This is a very sophisticated alteration, Ethan. Whoever did this knew exactly how to make it look legitimate while dramatically changing the beneficiaries of your estate." Sophie tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, this is exactly what Mom warned us about. Someone is trying to steal our family's promises." For the first time since Clara's death, Ethan felt a surge of the sharp business instincts that had built his empire. Someone was trying to defraud his family, and they had been using his grief as a weapon against him. The discovery of the forged will clauses transformed Ethan from a grieving widower into the formidable businessman who had built a medical technology empire from nothing. The fog of grief didn't disappear, but it no longer clouded his judgment. When it came to protecting his daughter's future, that evening, while Vanessa attended what she claimed was a yoga class, Ethan and Hal conducted a thorough investigation of the suspicious document. Using Hal's contacts in the legal community, they arranged for a forensic document analysis that would reveal exactly when and how the will had been altered. Sophie insisted on helping, approaching the investigation with the serious dedication of someone whose mother had trained her to understand the importance of legal documents. She sat at the big oak table in the study, her small hands carefully organizing papers while the adults worked. "Mr. Hal," Sophie said, pointing to a section of the original will, "this part here talks about Mom's jewelry going to me when I turn 18. Is that still safe?" Hal examined the section Sophie indicated. "Yes, dear one. This part hasn't been touched. But look here." He pointed to another paragraph. "The clause about your father's business shares has been completely rewritten." The forensic analysis results arrived via secure email within hours. The document examiner's report was damning. The suspicious sections had been created on a different computer, using a different printer, and inserted into the original document with sophisticated but detectable editing software. More chilling was the metadata analysis. The altered sections had been created on a computer registered to a private investigations firm known for corporate espionage and inheritance fraud schemes. "Vanessa has been planning this for months," Hal said, his voice heavy with the weight of betrayal discovered. "She's not just an opportunistic girlfriend, she's part of a professional operation that targets wealthy widowers during their most vulnerable periods." Ethan felt sick. Every kind word, every gentle touch, every moment of comfort Vanessa had provided, it had all been calculated manipulation designed to position herself to steal his family's legacy. But Sophie, with the resilience that only children possess, focused on solutions rather than despair. "Daddy, we caught her before she could finish stealing. That means we can stop her, right?" "Yes, sweetheart, we can stop her. But we need to be very careful about how we do it." Hal leaned back in his chair, his strategic mind already working through the legal and personal implications. "Ethan, the challenge we face is that Vanessa doesn't know we've discovered her scheme. If we confront her directly, she might destroy evidence or disappear before we can involve law enforcement. What do you suggest? We let her think her plan is working. We even help it along. If she believes you're about to sign a new will that includes her, she might reveal more of her operation, possibly implicating other victims or co-conspirators." Sophie looked worried. "But Daddy, what if she tricks you into really signing something bad?" Ethan knelt down beside his daughter's chair, taking her hands in his. The gesture reminded him powerfully of Clara, who had always made sure to get down to Sophie's eye level when discussing important matters. "Sophie, you've been braver and smarter than any adult in this house. You saw the danger when I was too blind to see it, and you made sure we investigated instead of just dismissing your concerns. I promise you, I will never sign anything that puts our family at risk. Your mother would be so proud of how you've protected us." Tears filled Sophie's eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than fear. For months, she had carried the weight of her mother's warnings and the burden of seeing threats that adults couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. Now, finally, the grown-ups were listening and taking action. Hal pulled out a fresh legal pad and began sketching their strategy. "Here's what we're going to do. Tomorrow, Ethan, you're going to tell Vanessa that you've decided to update your will to include her as a beneficiary. You'll say that Sophie has finally warmed up to the idea of having a new mother, and you want to make sure Vanessa is protected if anything happens to you. She'll want to see the new will before I sign it," Ethan said. "Exactly, and we'll give her a document to review, one that appears to give her everything she wants but actually contains legal language that will trap her into admitting her fraudulent intentions." Sophie raised her hand like she was in school. "What? About getting proof that she's been bad? If we just tell people, they might not believe us." Hal smiled at the little girl's legal thinking. "Sophie, you're absolutely right. We need evidence, and I think you might be the perfect person to help us get it." The old lawyer explained his plan. Sophie would wear a small recording device during a conversation with Vanessa. If they could get Vanessa to admit her intentions or threaten Sophie in any way, they would have the evidence needed to ensure she faced criminal charges rather than simply being asked to leave. Is that safe for Sophie? Ethan asked, his protective instincts flaring. We'll be monitoring everything in real time, Hal assured him. And Sophie will have a panic button she can press if she feels unsafe. Plus, Vanessa has no reason to suspect that a 7-year-old poses any threat to her plans. Sophie nodded gravely. Mom always said that sometimes the smallest people have to be the bravest ones. I can do this, Daddy. I can help catch the bad lady. As they finalized their plans, none of them noticed the small listening device hidden in the study's bookshelf, a device Vanessa had planted weeks ago to monitor exactly these kinds of conversations. The next morning dawned bright and clear, as if the universe itself was providing perfect lighting for the psychological drama about to unfold. Ethan sat across from Vanessa at their breakfast table, watching her with eyes that now saw past the carefully constructed facade of warmth and devotion to the calculating predator who had been systematically destroying his family's security for months. Vanessa looked absolutely radiant in the morning light, every detail of her appearance crafted to project trustworthiness and genuine affection. Her auburn hair caught golden highlights as she sipped her coffee, with the elegant precision of someone who understood that even small gestures contributed to her overall performance. The way she touched Ethan's hand while speaking, the concerned furrow of her brow when discussing Sophie's schoolwork, the gentle smile that seemed to promise healing and happiness. It was all masterfully executed theater designed to maintain her position while she completed her theft. Everything about her presence was calculated to reinforce the narrative she had been building since the day she entered their lives. That she was the loving partner who had rescued a grieving widower and his troubled daughter from despair. That she deserved gratitude and security in return for her sacrificial devotion, and that anyone who questioned her motives was simply unable to appreciate the depth of her love and commitment. Darling, Ethan began, using the endearment that now felt like broken glass in his mouth. I've been thinking seriously about what you said regarding our future together, about making sure you're properly protected and included in our family's long-term plans. Vanessa's eyes brightened with what appeared to be genuine joy and relief, but Ethan now recognized the subtle glitter of anticipated victory. Her reaction was precisely calibrated, not so enthusiastic as to seem mercenary, but unmistakably pleased in a way that revealed how long she had been waiting for this moment. Oh, Ethan, that means more to me than you could possibly know, she said, her voice carrying exactly the right mixture of gratitude and emotional vulnerability. I never wanted to pressure you about financial matters, especially during such a difficult time, but I do worry about our future together and my ability to continue caring for both you and Sophie if something unexpected were to happen. I've decided to update my will to include you as a significant beneficiary, Ethan continued, carefully watching Vanessa's reaction to gauge the depth of her preparation and expectations. I want you to know that if anything happens to me, you'll be taken care of financially and will have the security you need to continue the life we're building together. The response was immediate and profoundly telling. Instead of protesting that such measures weren't necessary, expressing surprise at the generosity, or showing concern about the implications for Sophie's inheritance, Vanessa leaned forward with undisguised interest in what appeared to be carefully rehearsed gratitude. That's incredibly thoughtful and responsible of you, Ethan, she said, her voice taking on a tone of mature appreciation that revealed she had been anticipating this conversation for weeks, or perhaps months. I have to admit, I've been lying, awake at night worrying about what would happen to all of us if something unexpected occurred. With your work in medical technology taking you to international conferences and involving cutting-edge research, there are always inherent risks. The way she mentioned risks sent a chill down Ethan's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Was she simply acknowledging the normal dangers inherent in business travel and corporate leadership, or was she contemplating more direct and intentional threats to his well-being? The ambiguity felt deliberately calculated, designed to plant seeds of vulnerability while maintaining plausible deniability. I've asked my lawyer to draft a comprehensive new will that includes substantial provisions for you, Ethan said, delivering the words that he knew would trigger Vanessa's most revealing responses. Would you like to review the document before I sign it? I want to make sure you're completely comfortable with all the arrangements and that nothing has been overlooked." Vanessa's attempt to contain her excitement was almost comically transparent to someone who now understood her true nature. Her eyes lit up with anticipation. Her posture straightened with interest, and her breathing quickened in a way that suggested she was fighting to maintain her composed exterior, while internally celebrating a long-awaited victory. "I think that would be very responsible and prudent of us," she replied, her voice carefully modulated to sound thoughtful rather than eager. After all, legal documents can be so complex and technical, and it's important that everything is crystal clear and properly structured to avoid any future complications or misunderstandings. From the kitchen doorway, Sophie watched the conversation with the intense focus of someone who now understood exactly what kind of danger her family had been facing. She wore a small recording device hidden in her favorite butterfly hairpin, a white device that Hal had obtained through his security consultant contacts. When Vanessa excused herself to take a phone call, Sophie approached her father. "Daddy, she's really excited about the money. Did you see how her eyes got all shiny when you talked about the will?" Ethan nodded grimly. "I saw it, sweetheart. Now comes the hard part. We need to get her to admit what she's really planning." That afternoon, Hal arrived at the Ward estate carrying what appeared to be a professionally drafted legal document, complete with official letterhead and the kind of formal language that characterized legitimate estate planning documents. The fake will had been crafted with extraordinary care and attention to detail. It included provisions that would give Vanessa substantial control over Ethan's business interests and personal assets, far more than any reasonable person would expect from a romantic relationship that had lasted less than a year. More importantly, for their investigative purposes, the document contained specific references to financial details and asset categories that had never been discussed in Vanessa's presence during any legitimate conversation. The document mentioned offshore accounts that didn't exist, real estate holdings that had been sold years earlier, and business partnerships that had been dissolved before Vanessa had entered their lives. Any normal person reviewing such a will would question these references or express confusion about assets they had never heard discussed. But someone who had been conducting unauthorized financial investigations would reveal their illicit knowledge by asking detailed questions about these fictional holdings. When Vanessa reviewed the document that evening, her response exceeded even Hal's sophisticated expectations for revealing criminal behavior. Instead of expressing surprise at the generous provisions, suggesting that they might be excessive for someone in her position, or asking basic questions about the family's financial situation, she immediately began demonstrating detailed knowledge about specific assets and accounts that had never been mentioned in any conversation she could have legitimately overheard. "This section about the offshore investment accounts," she said, pointing to a deliberately vague clause while her eyes scanned the document with the expertise of someone who had clearly studied financial documents extensively. "Shouldn't it be more specific about the Cayman holdings and the Swiss banking arrangements? I noticed the percentages seem inconsistent with the portfolio diversification strategy we discussed." Ethan and Hal exchanged meaningful glances across the room. There were no Cayman holdings, no Swiss banking arrangements, and no previous discussions about portfolio diversification strategies. Vanessa had just revealed knowledge she could only possess through unauthorized and probably illegal investigation of Ethan's private financial affairs. "How did you know about those accounts?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. Vanessa's face went pale as she realized her mistake. I thought you mentioned them once. Or maybe I misunderstood something in your business magazines." But the damage was done. She had revealed knowledge she couldn't possibly possess without having conducted sophisticated financial investigations into Ethan's private affairs. Sophie, listening from her spot in the corner where she was supposedly reading, pressed the button on her recording device that would alert Hal to pay special attention to the next few minutes of conversation. "Vanessa," Ethan continued, "I'm curious about your suggestions for structuring the inheritance. You seem to have very specific ideas about how family assets should be distributed." Vanessa took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried a hardness that neither Ethan nor Sophie had ever heard before. "Ethan, I think we need to be realistic about what's best for everyone involved. Sophie is just a child. She doesn't understand the complexities of managing substantial wealth. And honestly, your judgment hasn't been the clearest since Clara died. Someone needs to make sure these assets are properly protected and managed. The mask was finally slipping. This wasn't a woman in love offering gentle suggestions. This was a predator positioning herself to justify taking control of a family's entire legacy. The manipulation is becoming clear, but the most shocking revelation is still to come. What happened next would be seared into Sophie's memory forever, not just for its cruelty, but for how it revealed the true depths of evil that could hide behind a caring smile. As the afternoon wore on, Vanessa grew more comfortable with her newfound position of perceived control. She began speaking about the family's future with the authority of someone who believed she had already won the ultimate prize. Her suggestions became demands, her requests became expectations, and her gentle guidance became thinly veiled threats. Sophie needs structure, Vanessa declared as she moved through the house like she already owned it. All this indulgence since Clara died hasn't been good for her. Children need firm boundaries, and honestly, Ethan, you've been too permissive. Sophie, still wearing her recording device, listened to this woman discuss her future like she was a problem to be solved rather than a child to be loved. The little girl's hands trembled with anger and fear, but she remembered her mother's teachings about courage. Sometimes you have to be afraid and brave at the exact same time. That evening, when Ethan was called away on an urgent business call, Vanessa made her most revealing and most damaging mistake. She approached Sophie with a document and a pen, her demeanor completely different from the gentle stepmother act she performed for Ethan. "Sophie, I need you to sign this paper," Vanessa said, her voice carrying an edge that made the little girl's skin crawl. Sophie looked at the document, recognizing some of the legal language her mother had taught her to identify. It was titled Future Property Gift Agreement, words that sent alarm bells ringing in her head. "What is it?" Sophie asked, though she suspected she already knew. "It's a paper that says when you turn 18 you want to give me some of your inheritance because you're grateful for how I've taken care of your father. It's really just a formality, but it will make everything easier for everyone." Sophie's mind raced. This was exactly the kind of document her mother had warned her about, a paper designed to steal from children who were too young to understand what they were signing. "I don't want to sign it," Sophie said firmly. Vanessa's mask slipped completely. Her voice became cold and threatening. "Sophie, you need to understand something. Your father is going to marry me whether you like it or not, and when he does, I'm going to be the one making decisions about this house and your future. If you want to stay here, if you want to keep living in your mother's house, you need to start being more cooperative." Sophie felt ice-cold fear run through her veins, but she also felt something else, a strength that seemed to come directly from her mother's spirit. "You can't make me sign anything. Mom told me that no one can force children to sign papers, and if they try, it's against the law." Vanessa's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Your mother isn't here anymore, Sophie, and if you don't start being more reasonable, you might find yourself living somewhere else entirely. There are boarding schools for difficult children, places where little girls who can't appreciate good fortune learn to be more grateful." The threat was clear, and Sophie felt terror wash over her. But she also felt something her mother had taught her about the power of truth and the importance of evidence. "I still won't sign it," Sophie whispered, her voice shaking but determined. Vanessa grabbed Sophie's hand roughly, pressing the pen into her small fingers. "You will sign this, Sophie, and you'll do it right now, or I'll make sure your father knows just how ungrateful and disrespectful you've been. He's already tired of dealing with a difficult child. Don't make things worse for yourself." It was at this moment that Sophie made a decision that would save her family. Instead of continuing to resist or calling for help, she did something Vanessa never expected. She started asking questions. "If I sign this, what exactly will happen to my mom's things? Her jewelry and her books and her pictures?" Vanessa, believing she had finally broken the child's resistance, began explaining in detail how the property transfer would work, how Sophie's inheritance would be managed for her own good, and how grateful Sophie should be to have someone willing to take on such responsibility. Every word was being recorded by the device in Sophie's butterfly hairpin, And if I don't sign it? Sophie asked. Then you'll discover just how difficult life can become for ungrateful little girls, Vanessa said, her voice now openly menacing. Your father won't always be around to protect you, Sophie. Accidents happen. People get sick. And when they do, the people who are left behind need to be smart enough to appreciate those who are trying to help them. The implied threat was unmistakable. Vanessa wasn't just planning to steal the family's wealth, she was threatening a child with abandonment, abuse, or worse. Sophie looked up at this woman who had fooled her father, who had invaded their home, who had tried to steal their future, and she made a choice that would change everything. Okay, Sophie said quietly. I'll sign it. But instead of signing her name, Sophie wrote something else on the document, something that would expose Vanessa's entire operation and provide irrefutable evidence of attempted fraud and child endangerment. In her careful 7-year-old handwriting, Sophie wrote, My mommy told me never to sign papers for strangers who threaten children. This lady scared me and tried to steal Daddy's promises. When Vanessa saw what Sophie had written, her face contorted with fury. You little brat, you've ruined everything. And that's when Sophie pressed the panic button Hal had given her, sending an immediate alert to her father and setting in motion the events that would bring Vanessa's criminal operation crashing down. The sound of Sophie's panic button alarm cut through the house like a siren, bringing Ethan running from his office and Hal from the garden where he had been waiting and monitoring the situation. They burst into the living room to find Vanessa, standing over Sophie, her face twisted with rage and her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. You stupid child, Vanessa was screaming. Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand how much money you've just cost? Me? Ethan took in the scene, his daughter cowering but defiant, the threatening woman towering over her, and the papers scattered across the floor, and something primal and protective exploded within him. Get away from my daughter, he said, his voice carrying a deadly quiet that was more frightening than any shout. Vanessa spun around, her eyes wild with the desperation of someone whose elaborate scheme was collapsing in real time. Ethan, darling, you don't understand. Sophie has been— I understand perfectly, Ethan interrupted. I understand that you've been planning to defraud my family. I understand that you've been threatening my child. And I understand that every moment of our relationship has been a calculated lie. Hal stepped forward, holding a small recording device. We have everything, Vanessa. Your admission about the offshore accounts you couldn't possibly know about, your threats against Sophie, your attempt to coerce a minor into signing fraudulent documents. And most importantly, we have the forensic evidence that you altered my original will. The color drained from Vanessa's face as she realized the trap had been set long before this moment. You've been recording me? You've been spying on me? Sophie stood up, her small body shaking but her voice steady. You've been spying on us. You broke into Daddy's safe and took pictures of our private papers. You tried to steal Mom's promises to me, and you threatened to hurt me if I didn't help you steal more. Vanessa's eyes darted between the three faces watching her, searching for any sign of weakness or uncertainty she could exploit. Finding none, she made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Ethan, you're being manipulated by a jealous child and a senile old man, she said, her voice taking on the honey-sweet tone that had once provided comfort during his darkest days. I love you. I love both of you. Everything I've done has been to protect our future together. But Ethan was no longer the grief-stricken man who had been vulnerable to her manipulations. He was a father whose child had been threatened, a businessman who had been defrauded, and a man who had discovered that his trust had been weaponized against his family. The only thing you love is money that doesn't belong to you, Ethan said. Hal, please call the police. As Hal reached for his phone, Vanessa made one final desperate play. You'll never be able to prove any of this. It's the word of a child and two men who are clearly unstable with grief and age. No court will— Actually, Hal said calmly, we have quite a bit more evidence than you might think. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Vanessa Sterling, whose real name is Vanessa Rodriguez, has been under investigation by the FBI for inheritance fraud in 3 other states. She's part of a network that specifically targets wealthy widowers during their most vulnerable periods. Sophie gasped. She's done this to other families? Multiple families, dear one. Her operation involves extensive background research, psychological, profiling, and carefully planned infiltration of target households. She's responsible for stealing millions of dollars from grieving families over the past 5 years. Vanessa's face went from pale to ashen. How did you know about the federal investigation? Your mistake was altering a will that had been prepared by one of the most respected law firms in the Pacific Northwest. When I contacted them about the suspicious changes, they informed me that they had already flagged your activities to federal authorities based on similar alterations in documents from other clients. The sound of sirens approaching could be heard in the distance. Sophie moved closer to her father, who wrapped his arms around her protectively. "Daddy," she whispered, "did we catch all the bad people, or are there more?" "We caught the one who was trying to hurt our family, sweetheart. The police will handle the rest." As federal agents entered the house to arrest Vanessa, she made one last attempt to maintain her innocence. "This is all a misunderstanding. I've been nothing but loving and supportive to this family." But the evidence was overwhelming. The recording devices had captured her threats against Sophie. The forensic analysis had proven her document tampering, and most damning of all, the federal investigation had connected her to a network of similar crimes across multiple states. Agent Sarah Chen, the lead investigator, spoke with Ethan while her colleagues processed the scene. "Mr. Ward, your daughter's bravery may have saved not just your family's assets, but potentially prevented this network from victimizing other families. The evidence she helped gather will be crucial in prosecuting a much larger criminal operation." Sophie looked up at the FBI agent with curiosity. "Will the other families get their money back?" "We're going to do everything we can to make that happen," Agent Chen assured her. "Thanks to you, we now have the evidence we need to trace where the stolen assets went and begin the process of recovery." As Vanessa was led away in handcuffs, she turned back toward the house with one final look of rage and frustration. But Sophie wasn't watching her anymore. Instead, the little girl was looking at a framed photograph of her mother, tears of relief and gratitude streaming down her face. "We kept your promise, Mommy," she whispered. "We protected Daddy and kept our family's treasures safe." Sophie's courage saved her family, but this story shows us something profound about the power of listening to those we might overlook. Children and elderly wisdom often see what adults in crisis cannot. 3 months later, the Ward family sat in Hal's comfortable living room, surrounded by legal documents that told a completely different story than the fraudulent papers Vanessa had tried to create. These documents represented justice achieved, family bonds strengthened, and the careful reconstruction of trust that had been shattered by criminal manipulation and betrayal. The federal case against Vanessa Rodriguez and her sophisticated criminal network had made national headlines, not just for the scope of the financial fraud and the millions of dollars stolen from vulnerable families, but for the remarkable story of an 8-year-old girl whose courage and intelligence had helped expose a multi-state criminal conspiracy. Sophie's story had become a powerful symbol of childhood resilience and the critical importance of listening to voices that society often overlooks or dismisses. The media attention had been carefully managed by Hal and a team of victim advocates who understood the importance of protecting Sophie's privacy while using her story to educate other families about the warning signs of inheritance fraud. The little girl had given interviews to child-friendly news programs and had spoken at conferences about family safety, always with the goal of helping other children understand that their voices mattered and that adults should take their concerns seriously. The final asset recovery numbers came in today, Hal reported, adjusting his reading glasses to review the comprehensive financial documents that represented months of federal investigation and international cooperation. Between your family and the other victims across multiple states, federal investigators have managed to recover almost 80% of the stolen funds. The seized assets from the criminal network's offshore accounts, luxury properties, and hidden investments were more substantial than anyone had initially hoped. Ethan nodded with satisfaction, but his primary attention was focused on Sophie, who was curled up in Clara's favorite armchair with her mother's well-worn law book, reading a chapter about victims' rights advocacy with the same intense concentration that other children her age might give to adventure novels or fantasy stories. "How are the other families doing?" Sophie asked, looking up from her reading with the kind of mature concern that had characterized her approach to this entire ordeal. "Are the kids who got scared by bad people feeling better now? And did their daddies and mommies learn to listen to them when they say something is wrong?" "Much better, thanks to your example and advocacy," Hal said warmly, his voice carrying the pride that grandparents feel when watching children exceed every expectation for wisdom and courage. "The evidence you helped gather allowed federal investigators to locate families in California, Arizona, Nevada, and Florida who had been victimized by this same criminal network. Some of them had given up hope of ever seeing justice or recovering their stolen inheritance." Sophie smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had discovered that protecting one family often meant protecting many families, but it was a thoughtful, mature expression that reminded both men of how profoundly she had grown through this terrifying ordeal. "Mom always said that protecting one family means protecting all families, because bad people don't usually stop with just hurting one group of people. When you stop them from doing bad things, you're helping everyone they might have hurt in the future. Your mother was an exceptionally wise woman with a deep understanding of justice and social responsibility," Hal said, his voice carrying the reverence he had always felt for Clara's moral intelligence. "And she raised a daughter who not only inherited that wisdom, but has already put it into practice in ways that have made a real difference in the world." The healing process for the Ward family hadn't been simple, quick, or without significant emotional challenges. Ethan had struggled with profound guilt over allowing Vanessa into their lives, anger at his own emotional vulnerability during the grieving process, and the difficult challenge of rebuilding trust in his own judgment after being so thoroughly deceived by someone he had believed loved him. Sophie had needed extensive counseling to process the trauma of being threatened and psychologically manipulated by someone who was supposed to care for her, to understand that the betrayal wasn't her fault, and to work through the complex emotions that came from being both scared and proud of her own courage. The isolation of seeing danger that adults couldn't recognize, the burden of carrying her mother's warnings, and the responsibility of protecting her family had taken a psychological toll that required professional support to address. But through the healing process, they had also discovered strengths in each other and in their relationship that they hadn't known existed before the crisis. Ethan had learned to listen to his daughter's instincts and observations with the same respect and attention he gave to his most trusted business advisors. Sophie had learned that her voice carried weight and importance, that adults could make serious mistakes and needed children to help them see clearly, and that sometimes children had to be the ones to step forward and protect their families when danger threatened. "Daddy," Sophie said, closing her law book and moving to sit beside him on Hal's comfortable couch, "I want to ask you something really important about our future and what we're going to do to help other people. Anything you want to discuss? Sweetheart, your ideas and opinions matter more to me than you could possibly understand." Sophie's expression grew serious as she considered how to articulate thoughts that had been developing over months of reflection and recovery. "I want to learn much more about laws and protecting people who get tricked like we almost did. Not just reading Mom's books for fun, but really studying and learning about justice. Mr. Hal says there are special programs where kids can learn about helping people who get deceived by criminals and about making sure adults listen when children say something is wrong." Ethan looked at his 7-year-old daughter with amazement. "You want to study law?" "I want to help other kids who see bad things happening but don't know how to make adults listen to them. Mom always said that smart people have to use their smartness to protect people who need help." Hal smiled broadly. "Sophie, I think that's a wonderful goal, and I know some excellent programs designed specifically for young people who are interested in justice and advocacy." As they discussed Sophie's future education and Ethan's plans for strengthening his company's security protocols, a comfortable quiet settled over the room. It was the kind of peace that comes after surviving a storm, deeper and more appreciated than the calm that had never been tested. "I have one more piece of news," Hal said, pulling out a final document. "The federal prosecutor's office has asked if Sophie would be willing to participate in a victim impact statement for Vanessa's sentencing." It's completely optional, but they believe her perspective could be valuable for the court to understand the full impact of these crimes. Sophie considered this seriously. Would it help make sure she can't hurt other families? It might, Hal said. The judge will be determining not just her sentence but also the conditions of her eventual release and the monitoring she'll be under. Then I want to do it, Sophie said firmly. But I want to say something for all the families, not just us. 2 weeks later, Sophie stood before a federal judge in a courtroom filled with families who had been victimized by Vanessa's sophisticated criminal network, their faces showing a mixture of pain from their losses and hope for justice, finally, being served. Despite her small stature and young age, Sophie's voice carried clearly through the hushed courtroom as she read from a victim impact statement she had written herself, with careful attention to representing not just her own family's experience but the broader impact of inheritance fraud on vulnerable children and grieving families. Your Honor, my name is Sophie Ward and I'm 8 years old now, she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment and the weight of representing so many other victims. The lady who tried to steal from my family and hurt other families taught me something really important about how criminals think and operate. She thought that people who hurt children and families could count on nobody believing kids when they try to warn adults that something dangerous is happening. Sophie paused, looking around the courtroom at the other families whose lives had been devastated by the same criminal network that had targeted her father during his most vulnerable period. She thought my daddy wouldn't listen to me because some grown-ups sometimes think kids don't understand important things about money and legal papers and people who try to hurt families. But my mommy taught me before she died that understanding right and wrong isn't about being big or small, or old or young. It's about paying attention to how people behave and being brave enough to speak truth, even when it's scary and even when adults don't want to hear it. The little girl's voice grew stronger as she continued, her words carrying the moral authority of someone who had faced genuine danger and chosen courage over safety. The bad lady didn't just try to steal our money and our house and my mom's special things. She tried to steal my daddy's love for me and tried to make me feel like I didn't matter in my own family. She tried to make me sign papers that would have given her my mom's promises to me, and when I said no, she threatened to send me away from my home and everyone I love. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of determination rather than sadness, as she delivered the part of her statement that she hoped would make the biggest difference for other children. I hope that when other kids try to warn their families about bad people who want to hurt them, the grown-ups will listen better and take them seriously right away instead of waiting until the danger gets worse. And I hope the bad people who think they can trick families and steal from children learn that even little kids can be strong enough and smart enough to stop them and protect the people they love. When Sophie finished her statement, the courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of people crying, not tears of sadness, but tears of admiration for a child who had transformed her own trauma into a message of hope and protection for other vulnerable families. Vanessa Rodriguez was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, with additional civil judgments that would prevent her from ever benefiting financially from her crimes. 1 year after Vanessa's arrest, the Ward estate looked exactly the same from the outside, but everything within its walls had been transformed. The house that had once felt vulnerable and invaded now hummed with the energy of a family that had not just survived betrayal but had grown stronger because of it. Ethan sat in his study, the same room where Vanessa had once photographed his will, working on documents that represented hope rather than deception. He was establishing the Clara Ward Foundation for Child Advocacy, a nonprofit organization designed to teach children about their rights and provide resources for families dealing with inheritance fraud. Sophie, now 8 years old and enrolled in a special program for gifted children interested in law and justice, burst through the study door with the enthusiasm that had become her trademark when discussing her advocacy work. "Daddy," Mr. Hal just called, "and 3 more families have contacted the foundation. They saw our website and they want help because they think someone is trying to trick them too." Ethan smiled at his daughter's excitement about helping others. The foundation had become more than just a memorial to Clara. It had become Sophie's passion project and a source of healing for both of them. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Are they local families?" "One is from Oregon, but two are from other states. Mr. Hal says we might need to make the foundation bigger so we can help more people. Over the past year, Sophie had become something of a celebrity in child advocacy circles. Her story had been featured in magazines, she had spoken at conferences about childhood safety, and she had even testified before Congress about the importance of taking children's concerns seriously in cases of potential fraud or abuse. But more importantly, she had remained a child, curious, playful, and full of joy. The trauma of nearly losing her family's legacy had taught her about courage and justice, but it hadn't stolen her innocence or her faith in the possibility of goodness. "Sophie," Ethan said, setting down his pen and giving her his full attention, "I want to ask you something. Are you happy with how our lives have changed? Sometimes I worry that all this advocacy work and public attention is too much responsibility for someone your age." Sophie climbed into the large chair beside his desk, Clara's chair, which had become Sophie's favorite place for serious conversations. "Daddy, do you remember what Mom used to say about how every person has special jobs that only they can do?" "I remember. I think my special job is helping other kids learn that their voices matter. When grown-ups are sad or scared or confused, sometimes kids can see things more clearly. Mom taught me that, and now I can teach other kids." Ethan felt his heart swell with pride and amazement. His daughter had taken the most frightening experience of her young life and transformed it into a mission to protect other children. "But I also think my most important job is being your daughter and keeping Mom's promises safe," Sophie continued. "Mr. Hal helped us write a new will that says all the foundation work and all the money we use to help people comes from our families. Love, just like Mom wanted." That afternoon, they walked together to Hal's house for their weekly family dinner, a tradition that had emerged from the crisis and had become one of the most cherished parts of their routine. Hal, now officially Sophie's honorary grandfather and the foundation's legal advisor, had become the family elder they had never known they needed. As they sat around Hal's dining table, sharing stories about the week's advocacy work and Sophie's progress in her accelerated law studies program, Ethan marveled at how dramatically their lives had changed. A year ago, he had been an isolated, grieving man, vulnerable to predators who saw his pain as an opportunity. Today, he was part of a chosen family united by shared purpose and mutual protection. Sophie had gone from a frightened child whose warnings were dismissed to a confident young advocate whose voice carried weight in important conversations about justice. "I have an announcement," Hal said as they finished dessert. "The foundation has been invited to partner with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children on a new initiative about financial crimes against families." Sophie's eyes lit up. "Does that mean we can help even more kids?" "It means, my dear Sophie, that your mother's dream of protecting families through knowledge and advocacy is about to reach children across the entire country." As evening settled, over the quiet neighborhood, Sophie stood at the window of Hal's living room, looking out at the garden where she had once felt so alone and frightened. Now that same view represented safety, family, and the knowledge that she was surrounded by people who valued her voice and protected her dreams. "Daddy," she said, turning back to where Ethan and Hal were reviewing foundation documents, "I think Mom would be proud of what we've built." "I know she would be, sweetheart, and I think she'd be amazed by the brave, brilliant young woman you're becoming." Sophie smiled, then returned to her own reading, a book about children's rights that would help her prepare for next week's presentation to a group of family court judges. As she read, she occasionally glanced at the framed photograph of her mother that Hal kept on his mantelpiece. In that photograph, Clara was laughing, her arms wrapped around a much younger Sophie, both of them surrounded by law books and legal documents. It was a picture that captured everything the Ward family had fought to preserve: love, legacy, and the unbreakable bond between mothers and daughters that transcends even death. The little girl who had once warned her father not to let a stranger touch their will had grown into a young advocate who understood that family treasures weren't just money or property. They were values, promises, and the courage to protect what matters most. And in the quiet of that evening, surrounded by chosen family and the work that honored her mother's memory, Sophie Ward knew that some promises are worth every risk, every fight, and every moment of bravery required to keep them safe. Sophie's story reminds us that courage comes in all sizes, and the most important voices are often the ones we're least prepared to hear. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to remember that their voice matters too. Sometimes the smallest warnings carry the biggest truths, and sometimes the most vulnerable among us are actually our greatest protectors. Thank you for listening to Sophie's story, and remember, every family's legacy is worth defending.